Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're happy to have former Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about the impact the coronavirus might have on the legal job market based on some recent history. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have former Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about the impact the coronavirus might have on legal jobs. Welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining us in this kind of chaotic time. Well, for the record, we are recording this on March 25th, so we have no idea what's going to happen after this when you might be listening to it. And, to be honest, it seems kind of too early to start making a lot of pronouncements about what's going to happen, say, for this summer, maybe for OCI or other fall hiring. So we're probably going to do some later podcasts, as we get better information. Today, we're going to talk mostly actually about the past. And you might be wondering why, but a lot of our listeners may not actually be fully aware of this, but this is not the first time the legal job market has imploded in recent memory, right?
Definitely not. And in that other situation, it also felt sort of sudden and shocking, and everyone was sort of in chaos as well.
Yeah, so what we're talking about is basically the financial crisis in late 2008, which, as you pointed out when we were chatting earlier, was actually kind of still in the middle of some OCI, so a little bit different scenario. I had graduated, fairly recently. I was working in a firm after clerking, and you were at that time a law firm recruiter. Is that right?
Yes, I had recently started at a really large law firm, actually in August. Oh, wow. So I was really new to a job, and I was going to be working on the summer program.
Right. So you started in August. Things are looking pretty good. You're all excited about the summer. And then in October, basically, the financial markets blow up. What did people do?
Well, we kind of had to come up with some creative ways to handle the situation. And so the first thing that happened was quite a few law firms actually disappeared and went out of business.
Right, that's right.
So, yeah, that changed things because there were a lot of lawyers without jobs. And the nice thing was, from at least what I could tell in the market I was in, a lot of other firms took those lawyers in, like as groups, right. And even took some of their summer associates in. So I felt like, at least at some of the bigger places that kind of went under, they did find other firms to go to. And that was sort of the first thing that happened.
Yeah, I remember some of this. If anybody's interested, I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff in the Above the Law archives because they were definitely reporting heavily on this at the time. But it was all these sort of things that people thought would never happen, and all of a sudden they were happening like all the time. So there was this perception that, well, of course, a large law firm, they're not going to lay people off. No, they laid people off, like
definitely.
Of course they're not going to go out of business. No, they went out of business, and very quickly. Yeah, so
and very prestigious firms,
right?
Like firms, the same for financial institutions as well. That if you were around then, I don't think anyone could have imagined that Bear Stearns would be out of business in a matter of months.
Yeah.
So it was similar in the legal world too.
Yeah, and if anyone's curious, we're not going to name names on this podcast, but you can go back and look this up. And I think some people would actually probably be pretty surprised to find out who some of the first firms to really start laying people off were. Because we were all surprised.
Yes.
It was just like,
and
wow,
the
this is
other
happening.
thing is that it sort of happened in waves. So a lot of firms did one layoff, to some degree, and those people generally got better packages if they were in the first group. And then as sort of the financial crisis got worse over the next year, usually there were subsequent layoffs. So we were also living in this world of like uncertainty. Sure.
And also
over a long period of time.
Right. I was going to say it actually went on for a very long period of time. This wasn't something that went on for 6 months and then the economy turned around. This was literally years of people firms cutting classes and laying people off and not hiring people and all this stuff. And then suddenly it kind of turned around and everyone's sort of forgotten about this. But let's dive into it a little more. How do people handle summer associate programs? What if you'd already committed to, take a summer associate position at a firm in, say, September or early October, and then suddenly this all blew up? Did those programs even happen?
They did happen. We were lucky because we were still in the midst of making offers, and I think a lot of firms were. So you were able to sort of cut off some of the hiring because it hadn't completed yet. And for the students who now know that most of the hiring happens in July and August and it's done, that's the reason. Because what happened is that Harvard and Yale was still interviewing.
Oops.
And even being Harvard and Yale, most firms had to say, we cannot take very many of you. So that is why they changed how they did, their hiring, because they wanted to be in the same boat as all the other law students. But at least from my experience, the idea was sort of to cut it off as much as you could for people you hadn't made offers to. There were definitely firms that rescinded offers and changed how many people that they were taking. Generally, I would say that firms really tried not to do that. If you made a commitment to someone, we're going to have a summer class, and then you're planning enough ahead of time that you can say, okay, then the following summer, what some firms did was not have a summer class the following summer.
Oh, that's right. I forgot
Or
about
have
that.
an extremely small one. Some firms just hired 1Ls so that they knew that they were doing it way ahead of time and could just, hire a few 1Ls and kind of focus more in the future and keeping their name in the minds of students at certain law schools. So the idea was we're sort of stuck with what we already have for next summer, as much as, we've already made offers and had acceptances, but we can kind of figure out long term that we need to cut back summer classes. And, that's something that continued and still continues, that most of the firms that I know of do not have as big summer classes as they ever had before 2008.
Yeah, I was summering a few years before that. We had, 120, 130 people in the class. I don't think that anyone's ever gotten, close to that at that firm again, ever. It's probably half that, at least, if I had to guess, or less. In this scenario, we're not going to, I don't want to get too, fear-mongering and speculative. The one difference here is obviously, that was kind of one event, and it wasn't health-related. So I think, there could be other concerns here, but I hear you on firms kind of wanting to say, look, we made a commitment to people and we don't necessarily want to break that. That wasn't exactly the case with people that they made offers to, right? If you had accepted an offer and you had not yet started as an associate, those people really seem to have a lot of different options kind of presented and, have to choose or not be able to choose between them.
So what I would say is I did see a lot of creativity, which I was impressed with, because that's not something you usually associate with law firms.
Right.
And, there were definitely people who also had their offers rescinded who were in that situation. So not their summer offers, but their permanent offers.
Right.
So that happened. I think that today law students might think that could never happen. It can happen.
It can definitely
if they have
happen.
no other choice. No, I will say, I think that's a last resort. And I think if a firm is in a good financial position going into this, they really try not to do that. But what they did was try to come up with, like I said, creative solutions so that the class didn't all start at the same time. Mm-hmm. Because you're in a worse situation if you hire a huge class of incoming associates and have no work for them, because that's just going to lead to layoffs later on, because there's only so long you can do that for.
Right.
So some of the things that I saw were offering just straight up, you don't need to start next year if you don't want to.
Right.
So just seeing if there's anyone who maybe could get a clerkship, could figure out some other options, and we're totally happy for you to defer your offer for as long as you want. So that was kind of first step. And then the other thing was a lot of firms kind of figured out alternative places to put some of their summer or their incoming associates. Now, those people were put in other places. They were all public interest jobs, government jobs, nonprofits, all sorts of things. They were paid a smaller salary than the people who were starting as associates. So, that created a lot of issues. It wasn't clear to, I think, those students, like how those choices were made. And they were made for lots of different reasons. Practice group, trying to be fair the best way that they could. But ultimately it was, we're still trying to find a place for you, not rescind your offer, find something for you to do. And to be honest, a lot of those students were happy with the placements that they got because they were actually making more money than they would have if they just worked for that organization, straight up got a job with them. And they got to do that for a year, get experience, and then still had like a future job at the law firm making a full first year associate salary. So that is what a lot of big firms did, was try to sort of split up the class.
Yeah, and I'm sure that caused some resentment among people who actually wanted those public interest jobs,
Yes.
but it's not a perfect
Exactly.
world. So,
and it was actually quite a challenge to place them at these organizations because a lot of the organizations were like, well, we'll have to train them, and that's not even necessarily helpful for us. So I think kind of how it worked was some of the students already had relationships with them, or firms have relationships with them. So that was sort of the ideal. Like, we already work with you. We're going to give you a free associate for the year. And so overall, I think, it worked out. But for sure, for the people who weren't in that situation, they had a lot of their jobs taken away for the big firm associates.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty crazy situation all around. There were a lot of people scrambling in a lot of different directions, kind of like it seems like the situation we're sort of in right now. And what about associates who had already started working? What happened to those people?
People were definitely laid off. And I will say that people were laid off who were first years.
Yeah.
So there was a variety. Obviously there were certain practice groups where the layoffs were deeper because they realized that there just wouldn't be work for years.
Right.
And so it was just, some of it was like the luck of the draw. Like, you picked, corporate law, or you picked real estate, and we just don't see any way that we're going to be able to keep you on. So some of them were laid off, and it did, I think, kind of seem random to people, and again cause resentment.
Right.
But it's kind of a lesson in, I think until then a lot of people had felt really secure about what it meant to get to the point where you have a big law job. And I think, it is a lesson that nothing's for certain. And so you have to sort of go with it and figure out what you're going to do.
Yeah, and it is interesting to me that I feel like there has been this collective amnesia about this whole thing. Because at the time, I remember everyone thinking like, oh, wow, people will remember forever like who these firms were that started laying people off. And I would imagine the average 3L at any law school in America could not even begin to answer that question.
And the other thing about the time is it feels slightly similar to now in that the couple years before that, everyone was riding really high.
Right.
And the economy was great and there were lots of jobs. And I would say that most firms maybe hired their biggest summer class ever from the summer of 2008. And so it does feel similar because, the economy has been really good. And unemployment has been so low recently. So I think it was the same kind of sort of shock to go from one extreme to another.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, hopefully we don't really see a repeat of this, but we don't really know. And I mean, like we were talking about earlier, obviously this massively impacted other organizations that are not large law firms too, I mean, nonprofits were not really being able to hire, nobody was donating, nobody was charity. I mean, we actually had 2 career conferences in 2013, I believe it was. So this is even 5 years later, just about, what people can do in this scenario where they're graduating and they're not getting the jobs they thought they were going to get. And those jobs literally don't exist anymore. I mean, for the upside, for some people at least, there were opportunities in all this chaos, right?
Definitely. And that's why I think, having lived through it, my advice to everybody in any economy is that you need to be flexible.
Right.
And I think people forget that when they feel like they're in the power position and they're really wanted. Because I do always say, you never know when things are going to change. So if you make yourself so tied to a certain practice group, that may backfire if something changes suddenly. So I think it's like a good lesson for being flexible, being open, trying to, remember that jobs are not always available. And sometimes you have to be creative. And no matter, where you came from, what law school, what opportunities you had yesterday, like things change.
Yeah, and I think for most people, there's going to be some sort of grieving over that. They're like, you had all these amazing opportunities, and maybe now they seem like they have completely dried up. And maybe in 6 months, they haven't dried up. But maybe right now, that's what it seems like in the way that it is. I mean, I wonder, too, about people who, we did a recent episode on applying for a summer job in the spring. Well, all that's kind of out the window, I would imagine, or at least a lot of it.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to look for other opportunities. It's hard to say what the world is going to be this summer and what people are even going to be able to do. But I think that, like we've sort of mentioned before, at some point maybe you just say, okay, I haven't found anything and I'm not going to be able to find like a typical legal job, but maybe I can work for a professor and do research or other, options so that I do something this summer.
Yeah, and I think on that point, what I would say is also just keep applying to things because it's going to be very unclear who is actually hiring right now. And maybe this week, basically no one's hiring, so everyone's trying to figure out what they're doing. But, in a few weeks, I would imagine certain people, certain organizations are going to say, okay, our finances actually look pretty stable. Like, I feel like we can start to think about bringing someone on for the summer. But it's going to be really unpredictable who those organizations are, particularly right now with like courts closed and things like, can you even do essentially, public interest work or litigation or pro bono? Like, we don't know.
And usually in these situations, some businesses are going to completely go under and some industries are going to be hit harder, but there's like other industries that may have more opportunities. And I think that happens in these situations. And so maybe you need to pivot.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people started firms, whether, started law firms or businesses in the last recession. I mean, we started this business in the middle of the last recession. So I do think, sometimes there are those opportunities to look for things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have looked at. I mean, I would imagine that at least some of those people who tried out a big law or, thought they were going to big law and tried out a public interest position for a year actually decided to continue and are probably, pretty happy with that choice.
Definitely. I mean, I think sometimes it's not what you expected, but you're, happy with the end result. And I know people that ended up in practice groups that were the opposite of what they went for when they were coming out of law school. And they're happy with how it turned out. And really, they're happy that they have a job and they survived and they kept going. So I think that, life isn't always what you expect it's going to be, but it doesn't mean it won't work out.
Yeah, I guess we won't get into the big looming question right now of are we going to take the bar exam? That's a podcast for an episode for a different podcast. You can go listen to our bar exam toolbox podcast. We are talking about that question a lot. Right now, I would say assume that that exam is going to happen and you will have a way to be licensed, but we cannot guarantee that. All right. I mean, what else can we tell people at this point who are just smack in the middle of this and wondering what the future is going to hold? What are we telling them?
Well, I can't tell you what the future is going to hold. I wish I could. I wish I could even tell you, how your school year is going to end and what you're going to be able to do this summer if you already have a job. I just don't know going forward. But I will say that I think the key to this is to be flexible, keep on top of it, just keep going. You still have school, you're still doing your day-to-day. I think that that's important right now because we don't really know long-term where this is going. And I would say you just kind of keep on top of it. I agree with you. You keep applying for things. You keep talking to people. Another thing that I would consider coming out of this is what happened in 2008, I think made a lot of people realize that they should be aware of the places that they're starting at and like in what kind of financial situation they're in. And I think those are questions to kind of research and have a good idea about. I think a lot of law students, especially looking at big law, are just picking them based on the, top 100 list and what's ranked higher. But I think that's something to also keep in mind is, does it seem like it's well run? Does it seem like they don't have a lot of debt? Because firms will tell you things like that. They have to report things. And I think it's something that law students really don't think about, especially in a good economy. But that was something that came out of that situation, because the truth is the firms that went under were not in great condition, no matter what they seemed like. And it was something that people, I do think, sort of knew. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you have choices, when there's different options, just like how you're looking at where you're going.
I think that's absolutely right. I think you should go back in those above the law archives and maybe look at who, some of the firms that did this sort of stuff first were. Maybe you don't trust them for the future. Sorry, that is on the record. You can go find it. I think you're absolutely right. And you can see
why the firms went under that did go under, because we know why.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, like you said, a lot of this is information that is reported that you can go and look up, and you probably want to get familiar with some of these numbers if you haven't accepted a job yet. If you're thinking about where you want to bid for the upcoming OCI, assuming that happens, you want to actually look at the financial condition of these things. Like, you can't just kind of sign. It's kind of like going to a law school. Like, you need to look at the numbers. Like, what are their job placement numbers like? What are their bar passage rates like? And not necessarily believe what they tell you, but what do the actual numbers tell you? Because I think you're right. I mean, I don't think that many people who are paying attention were that shocked by who some of these things happened to. They might have been shocked by the outcome of, like, they actually went under in a matter of days, but it wasn't that shocking if you kind of looked at, their financial system and you're like, oh yeah, you know what? They probably are like over leveraged or whatever it is.
And if you talk to like the law firm partners at the time, none of them were surprised. Right. Like, they all knew.
Yeah. So maybe there's some dirty little secrets hiding in plain sight that we are also about to find out. Hopefully no one ends up at one of those places. But, if you do, I guess like there are lessons to be learned. I think that's the main takeaway, I got from that, is that sometimes things can change it feels like instantly. But I hope that we take something from it. And even though this situation is different in a lot of ways, I think a lot of the uncertainty is similar. And I think some of the lessons are the same, that you can take out of it. Yeah, and I think too, I'm just thinking about, the people that blow up first are probably the people that have had financial issues all along, or at least for, some number of years. And then I think you see it's when it starts the really slow and grinding process of like everyone starts having the same problems because the money just isn't coming in. And then I think it's almost better to have people react more quickly, Like,
definitely,
if everyone's laying people off except your firm, you might want to question why that is. Like, are they, in some cases, like actually where I worked, there were just weird reasons that they had a lot of money coming in because they were suing banks and things like that because they didn't have corporate clients. So we actually had a ton of money coming in, but that was pretty abnormal. So you can, as an associate at these places, just kind of also think like, hey, does this seem sustainable? And if the answer is no, you might need to be looking at other options, because eventually people are going to run out of money.
Because there were places that said, we will never do layoffs, and then they did layoffs.
Right. Yeah, it's like you don't want I feel like at this point, hopefully most people would not ever say that again, but maybe they would. Yeah. I don't know.
Or same with rescinding offers. But I will say I think that is a last resort for places. They know that long term, that's not going to look good, and it's not what they want to do. Yeah, exactly.
Again, go look it up. Again, like we don't know that the firms that were in that position in 2008 are the same people who'd be in that position in 2020. Like, we just don't know. And I do think, these are questions that you probably could and should be asking people, obviously people can't really provide an answer, but I think they hopefully are at least thinking about how they might react. How might you react if X happens? How might you react if Y happens? Hopefully these are conversations that are taking place.
Definitely.
All right. Well, anything else you want to talk about at this point? I know we're going to do some more specific podcasts to help people navigate the situation as it develops.
I think just the overall lesson of being flexible. I really think that's the key to getting through this. And I think it's something that people should always keep in mind, no matter where you are in this process, or what law school you're at, or what your grades are, or how many offers you had. That it's always good to remember that sometimes what you thought you were going to do is not available anymore. And, you can mourn that and you can feel bad about that. But then I think you need to find a way forward.
I completely agree. I mean, imagine someone who's like, no, I want to do this practice area and this is the only practice area I'm willing to do, versus someone who's like, hey, you know what? I know I said I wanted to do this and I was really interested in it, but whatever you guys can find for me to do, I would be totally happy to do. Who of those are you going to want to keep?
And I know very few people who got completely switched and then long term really thought much about it, to be totally honest.
Well,
you just do what you do.
Yeah, how do you know?
Exactly.
I mean, it's like, oh, I want to do corporate M&A. You've never done that. You don't know what that's like.
Or I think people have this idea, this is what a litigator is. You know, this is who you have to be. And the truth is, it doesn't have to be the same person. There isn't one person for any of these things. And so in this world, I just think that some things are going to disappear or go away or not be as big for a while. And some things are going to be bigger and more important. And so, there's some creative ways to move forward. And hopefully we'll have some more information soon.
Hopefully. All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Good luck to everybody listening out there. We know it's a very uncertain time. Hopefully this has been some useful historical context for you as well. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.